Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Paul Golan. I'm Executive Director of the Society for Humanistic Judaism, and our pluralistic social justice initiative is called Jews for a Secular Democracy. For those of you who may be joining us and have not yet heard about Jews for a Secular Democracy, just very briefly, this is an initiative that brings the full gamut of Jewish identity and custom, history, religious perspectives, including secular perspectives, on church-state separation issues. I think that historically Jews have benefited greatly from freedom and freedom of religion in the United States. And we're now at a time when that is threatened. So we've been working for several years now to raise the alarms. We're very excited to have Dr. Bradley Onishi with us today, who will be introduced by Linda Levy, who I'm going to introduce in a moment. But if this is the first time you're hearing about Jews for Secular Democracy, jfasd.org is our website. Please get involved. We can use all the help we can get. This is a particularly relevant year to be doing this kind of work. And for those who have not yet heard of the Society for Humanistic Judaism, we are a denomination of American Jewry. We've been around over 60 years, and we take a non-theistic approach to Jewish ritual. So we still celebrate as communities Jewish holidays, Jewish life cycle events, and we do it with a liturgy that does not reference God or the supernatural, and it has allowed literally tens of thousands of Jewish households over the last 60 years to remain connected to organized Judaism without ever having to say things that they don't believe and only say things that they do believe. So that's a bit about us. And now let me tell you a bit about Linda Levy. Is a board member of Women Confronting Racism, which is committed to helping white women do their own work, examining their impact and explicit biases, and to provide informational programs and real-world solutions in order to work towards the eradication of systematic racism. Women Confronting Racism joins allies in anti-racist efforts to effect dynamic change in our local, state, and national communities. Linda is also a state policy advocate for the National Council of Jewish Women Michigan, where she serves as a voice for NCJW policies on the local, state, and national levels that strive to effect social justice by improving the quality of life for women, children, and families, and by safeguarding individual rights and freedom. Thank you both for being here. Linda, take it away.
Thank you, Paul. I am Linda Levy, and it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's guest speaker. Dr. Bradley Onishi is founder of Access Monday Media, co-host of Straight White American Jesus podcast, and the author of the incredible book that we're going to be discussing tonight, Preparing for War, The Extremist History of White Christian Nationalism and What Comes Next. He is on the faculty of the University of San Francisco. His work has appeared on New York Times, NBC News, Rolling Stone, HuffPost, and many other outlets. Welcome, Dr. Onishi.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation to be here. Thankful to Paul and especially to Katie and Linda for all the organization and admin behind the scenes, and just really appreciate it. So want to talk today about Christian nationalism, something that's quite, I think, pressing in our contemporary public square. There was some news today about a former president being on the ballot and the Supreme Court. And anyway, these are things that I think are going to be issues that we are going to need to confront as we go into the elections this year and beyond. So I just want to speak for a few minutes about what I understand Christian nationalism to be, and then we'll go into questions, and I promise I won't talk for very long and drone on. So let me just share with you a couple of slides about Christian nationalism and what I think it is, and then we can further our conversation. So white Christian nationalism, what is it, and how does it work in the United States? We had the Iowa caucuses just a bit ago, and I don't think that playing this video is going to work very well sound-wise, so I'm going to summarize it for you. January 14, start of the Iowa caucuses, there was a gentleman here being interviewed and asked about, would you rather have, 4 more years of Joe Biden or 4 more years of Donald Trump if he's behind bars and in jail and that kind of thing? And this guy says, well, I'd rather have Trump forever because this country needs a dictator. And that's a direct quote. This country needs a dictator. So that's incredibly scary. It's incredibly anti-democratic. It's incredibly explicit about a desire for an autocrat or a fascist regime or something of that nature. Well, where does that come from? How does that work? We know that at the Iowa caucuses, about 55% of people who voted overall were white evangelicals. Iowa's that kind of state. A lot of folks who were there are folks who, as the numbers showed, voted for Trump. Where do these sentiments come from? Let me dig into that just for a moment, and then we'll talk further. I want to argue that we've reached a point where democracy is not a sacred value to many Americans, such as the gentleman in the previous slide, but at which they are ready to express that fact proudly in public. So it's not just that it's not a sacred value, but they're willing to say it out loud. And that is something that is an extra degree of scary. There's an authoritarian threat to American democracy, and Christian nationalism is a driving force of this threat. The 2024 elections will decide the direction of the country for generations, and happy to talk about that throughout today. So what is Christian nationalism? Christian nationalism has a couple of components that I'll just discuss briefly: the myth of the Christian nation, nostalgia for past glory, and an apocalyptic view of the nation's future. If you want a very handy definition of Christian nationalism to take home, my argument would be that Christian nationalism is the idea that Christians should be privileged in the United States in any way. And so if you believe that Christians somehow should have privilege, that their beliefs, their culture, their ethos should have a rank among others, then you are a Christian nationalist. This could be as simple as you're a church-going person in Iowa or in Idaho or in Georgia, and you tell people, I don't vote for people who aren't Christian because this is a Christian country that should only have Christian presidents. Or, it says in God we trust on the money because this is a Christian country and that's what it should say. Those folks are Christian nationalists. Now, they may not be in militias. They may not be out at the Iowa caucuses saying, hey, we need a dictator. But nonetheless, that's Christian nationalism. Well, on the far end of the spectrum are Christian nationalists who have extreme anti-democratic views. My friend and colleague Paul Jupe, a sociologist at Denison University, did a recent study that found that 9% of Americans think that only Christians should be able to be citizens in the country. Another finding of his was that 14% of folks in this country think that the church, their church, should have some sort of veto over the government's laws and policies. Those are Christian nationalist beliefs, and 9% of the population is more than you might expect. We have a crying baby in my house. I apologize. Let me make sure we don't hear that crying baby real quick. Okay. Christian nationalism is on a spectrum. There are Christian nationalists who, again, I think we wouldn't consider grave threats to democracy, but nonetheless think Christians should be privileged. Then there are those who are willing to say only Christians should be citizens. And where does that come from? Well, here's the components: the myth of the Christian nation, the idea of nostalgia for our past glory, and an apocalyptic future. Christian nationalists think that this country was built for and by Christians. They don't see the separation of church and state as a real thing. They think that that's propaganda. Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House, is somebody who's been willing to say separation of church and state was never meant the way that you think it was. So there's a sense in which they think that this country was built for them and by them. And don't get me wrong, happy to talk in the questions and Q&A period about all the various Christian people in the history of this country. I tell my students this all the time. But the story is so complicated. The story is so nuanced. The version that we get from Christian nationalists is simply, it's a Christian nation, that's it. My ears are shut, I don't want to talk about it anymore. They also believe that God chose this nation to play an exceptional role in human history, and therefore God chose them to play an exceptional role in human history. There's a sense of them playing a part in a story that is much bigger than them and fighting for a nation as part of a cosmic war. I'm just going to say that again. A lot of Christian nationalists think that they're fighting a national conflict that is part of a cosmic war. And that gives weight and gravitas to their actions, and we can come back to that. Okay. Now, some Christian nationalists, and may be surprising, are not people who attend church regularly. And you might be thinking, well, how does that work? And I think the argument from sociologists and political scientists and historians would be is that Christian nationalism is a cultural identity. It's a story you tell, as I just said, about yourself, about your country. And so if it's a story you tell, you can tell that story without having to go to Bible study twice a week or get up and pray before work or attend service on Sundays. You can talk about this being a Christian nation and we got to get back to Christian values without being somebody who actually is really interested in reading the Bible regularly or going to participate in their local church. The nostalgia for past glory is something that I don't know that I need to explain that much. There's just this deep sense that America used to be great, but it no longer is. And we have to get back to that. Well, getting back to that for Christian nationalists has a very specific flavor. In 2016, 70% of white evangelicals told Public Research Institute, Public Religion Research Institute, that they believe the country has changed for the worse since the 1950s. To be brief, when somebody tells me that America was great in the 1950s, I think, so you're telling me before the Civil Rights Movement, before the Civil Rights Act, before voting rights, the Voting Rights Act, before sweeping immigration reform, before we had the Loving case, before we had the publication of the Feminine Mystique, before we had Stonewall. I mean, you're telling me that all those things made America worse. And in that way, you're telling me exactly what you want America to be. Here's a quote from Focus on the Family executive and a former Bush administration official who says basically in this quote that since the 1960s, the sexual revolution and the decline of the nuclear family and the independence of women has really destroyed this country's foundation. And that is a common refrain among Christian nationalists. There's an idea built into that the nuclear family, and I should say the heterosexual Christian nuclear family, is really the foundation of society. It's a patriarchal vision. And the idea is if you can order the family the right way with a man and a wife, a patriarchal structure, 2 children who believe their dad is the voice of God, well, that is the sort of blueprint for wider society. That's how the church should look. That's also how the government and our culture should look. So there's a sense of when folks talk about family values of wanting their family structure to be superimposed on our entire society, such that if you have a mixed family, a queer family, if you have an interracial marriage, perhaps, there's various suspicions that you're not a good American and you're sort of destroying the moral order that should govern this country. We've reached a place, and I won't hover here very long, where Christian nationalists are openly saying that Martin Luther King Jr. was a bad guy. This is part of the sense of the country going downhill since the 1960s. They're openly saying the civil rights movement and and Martin Luther King Jr. were bad for American society. Happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. This one is where I'll finish, and before we go to questions. We have a situation where Christian nationalists really believe that the country is in steep decline. If you study the history of fascism, there's always a sense in which the fascist impulses or desires are built around the idea that a certain group has been victimized. In this case, it's Christians, and that because they've been victimized, the country has lost its way. That's the nostalgia. And therefore, we're in a crisis such that if we're not willing to address the crisis with extreme measures, then the country will no longer exist. Many folks said before the last presidential election that if you elect Joe Biden, it will be the end of America as you know it. There was the common idea that Joe Biden is a Marxist and a communist and someone who is godless. I have a lot of opinions about Joe Biden. I won't share today, but Joe Biden is somebody who has been in the Senate a long time. He's pretty moderate. He also goes to mass. He's a Catholic, goes to mass like 3 times a week. The idea, though, is that Joe Biden's not the right kind of Christian. He's not the right kind of American, and therefore, in his hands as president, the country will go into catastrophic decline. This last point, I think, is really important for our discussion today because I want to just emphasize that if you believe that you're in a crisis situation, you're going to act in a way that is much different than you would act in a normal kind of period. Let me give you an example. You just might have heard my baby crying. I have a 4-month-old baby. We also have a 2-year-old. And it takes a lot to get a 2-year-old and a 4-month-old outside the house. I don't know if you've ever tried this, but it takes about 68 minutes to go to Target or to go to the grocery store. You got to get diapers and a change of clothes and a diaper bag. You got to get clothes on the babies. You got to get shoes on the 2-year-old who doesn't want to wear shoes, a jacket on the 2-year-old who doesn't want to, and then you get to the car and you realize, you're not wearing a shirt, so it'd probably be good for you to wear one when you go to the grocery store, the whole thing. But you make sure you have everything because you're thinking ahead. We need milk. We need water. We need snacks. Okay, great. I live in California. If there's an earthquake, we don't do that, do we? We don't think about normal procedure. We don't think that, hey, we have to do it this way because this is best practice. And everyone is going to be better off in the long run if we do it the right way. When there's an earthquake, we just grab the babies and get under the table or run out of the house because there's a crisis. If you can convince people that there is a crisis, if you can convince them that there is an apocalypse right now, you'll have 2 things going for you. You can recruit them into a story that says, are you willing to participate in something that is way bigger than you? You're not somebody who's going to join this epic in the middle, in the boring parts. You're not going to be in volume 2 of Lord of the Rings. You're not going to be in the 2nd installment of the trilogy. This is the final battle. Are you willing to get here? Are you willing to come to the Capitol on January 6th? Are you willing to join a trucker convoy that's on its way to the border? Because this is it. This is the last chance to participate in this story, in this conflict. We need you. It's a great recruiting tool. But even more than that, going back to the gentleman who's willing to say we need a dictator, if you're in crisis, you can convince people that doing things that are not normal, doing things that are beyond best practice, not thinking ahead, not doing things that are going to benefit everyone in the long run is actually how you should act. Because if you're in crisis, you need to take extreme measures to save yourself. And that might mean, in this case, overstepping democracy. That might mean, in this case, saying we don't have time for process and democratic norms. We need a strong leader that will just save the country from itself. Who has time for all these judges and appeals and all this bureaucratic deep state mess? We just need to take the country back, period. To me, the crisis and the nostalgia, they all work together to create a moment where many, including many Christian nationalists, are willing to say, if we have to sacrifice democracy in order to get our country back, well, then it's worth it. We will do it. Democracy is not the goal. And in fact, if democracy gets in the way, if democracy becomes something that is an obstacle rather than an aid, then we'll just overstep it. We'll get rid of it because the goal is a country that looks how we want it to look. It's a social order that is arranged in ways that we feel as if we have the proper role and power in that place. And so we are willing to do whatever it takes to make that happen. Restoring America doesn't mean restoring democracy. It might just mean the opposite. Democracy is not the sacred value in this equation. It is not the goal. The goal is power. The goal is to colonize Earth for God. If democracy becomes a problem rather than a solution to that goal, then democracy will be put aside. Happy to talk about any and all of this material as we get into questions and start our discussion. And so we'll just say thanks for listening in that very brief tour de force, and hope we can have some really good discussion as we go today.
Great, thank you. That was a really powerful overview and scary. And if folks want to put questions in the Q&A, there's, I think on most people's Zoom screen, there's a little Q&A button at the bottom. There's also a chat for you to communicate with the panelists. And I know that I have questions, and Linda also has some, and I just wanted to ask, you know, you definitely touched on this quite a bit, but that it appears many white Christian nationalists are willing to overthrow democracy in the name of their movement. Obviously, you agree with that, but why, and what, can you talk about the mechanism that's kind of driving this anti-democratic force within them? You're on mute.
I'll just share one or two slides to answer this question, if that's okay, Paul,
Sure.
because I think it goes right to what you're asking. You're right about this, first of all. So this gentleman says we need a dictator. All right, you might think, well, that's somebody at a Trump rally. Is he really somebody expressing something that's running through the current of Christian nationalist movements and MAGA communities? And the answer is yes. So here's Kevin Slack, a political scientist at Hillsdale College, a very powerful Christian college. And he talks about the idea that the country needs a new Caesar, right? A red Caesar. Michael Anton works at the Claremont Institute, same place as John Eastman, the famous lawyer for Trump who helped him cook up his idea. And he talks about the benefits of Caesarism and the breakdown of the Republican constitutional rule, okay? There is Patrick Deneen, philosopher at Notre Dame, who talks about a yearning for a strong leader, one with the will to take back popular control over liberalism's forms of bureaucratized government and globalized economy. This comes after decades of liberal dismantling of cultural norms and political habits essential to self-governance. I have like 20 more slides. I won't scare you anymore. You asked about the mechanism, and I think it comes in Deneen's statement there. The argument would be that the social order of this country, according to the Christian nationalists, has broken down to the place that there's no saving it from itself, that elections don't work. It doesn't matter how many folks you get into the Congress or the legislature. It just doesn't seem to work. And what they're really saying is, no matter what we do, there's just still gay people and people of color. There's still immigrants. There's still mixed families. And the sum of non-Christians in the country just keeps going up. So in order to save the country from itself, you see all of this musing on the American right in Christian nationalist circles about a red Caesar, about a benevolent monarch, about a Christian prince. And I really think it's them saying, if we don't have the majority, if we can't vote our way out of this, should we persuade people? Maybe have a movement that gets out there and really says, how do we get the young folks on our side? Nah. Let's get Caesar. That's a good option. Caesar is maybe the way. And I think really that's the impulse there. And it's really scary to see it take root.
You know, Dr. Onishi, you had said in your, when you were talking, that one of the issues was getting the right kind of Christian to be the leader. And in your book, you talk about how it would seem that when we had President Carter, he should have been the right Christian. He was a white evangelist. He was married with children, and he should have been the ideal. But instead, the evangelists turned against him and really went for Reagan, who was divorced, remarried, did not have a great relationship with his children. Can you talk a little bit, and supported abortion? Can you talk a little bit about that phenomenon?
Yeah, you know, I think that's the election that really shows us that the goal is power and not values or identity. Jimmy Carter's like made in a lab. You know, like if any of you play video games and you get to create a character, Jimmy Carter's like, create a character you think white conservative Christians want to be in the White House. He's born in like a rural corner of the country, peanut farmer, Southern Baptist family, military officer, marries the only girl he ever dated in high school. And they've been married, you know, Rosalind, rest in peace, died a few months back, but they were married how many decades? When his daddy dies, goes home, takes over the farm, doesn't leave the house without a Bible. What else do you want? And yet, you know, he becomes president in 1976. He's not a war hawk. right? He wants to negotiate. He wants diplomacy. He appoints more women and people of color to the federal judiciary than anyone before him. I love this part. It's not in the book, but he put solar panels on the White House. I don't know if anyone remembers that. Ronald Reagan took him down. He, is somebody who did not come out against, gay folks and gay representation in ways that the Jerry Falwells of the world wanted him to. So all of a sudden in 1980, the conservative Christians you think would have just made him in the video game character do everything they can to get him out. And it's about power and policy over values and faith. And we see that's such a foreshadowing of Trump and what happened in 2016 and 2020. That the goal was a guy that would not only do their bidding, and I think this is where people get some of this wrong. It's not only that they wanted somebody who might do some of their policy initiatives or whatever, but when we got to Trump, it had morphed into somebody that would hurt the people they thought should hurt. Like, it's time to stop playing. If we can get a guy that will brutalize the people that need that, then maybe they'll finally stop, right? George W. Bush didn't do it. Reagan didn't do it. And then we got Obama. And if you have somebody who's made in a lab for the white conservative Christian, like Jimmy Carter, Barack Obama's like made in a lab to scare them. I mean, he is like mixed race. Dad is from another country. Dad is black. Kids are black. Wife is black. Grew up in Hawaii. Is that even a state? Do they use American dollars there? Who knows? Right? Okay. And so his name's Barack. His name's Hussein. Right? So George W. Bush was like too nice somehow. That whole invasion of Iraq, whatever. He was like too nice. We need somebody who's mean, like a bully. And so by the time we get to Trump, we have, I think, a repeat of that Reagan-Carter phenomenon, but in a way that was way more explicitly open about needing a barbarian to take care of the folks that they saw as their enemies.
There have been a couple of folks who have asked about anti-Semitism, and I did want to kind of unpack the relationship to Jews. Someone also mentioned the very weird relationship between evangelical Christianity and support for Israel. So there's like a lot to unpack there. But one of the things I wanted to couch this in is the thing to me that was so fascinating about your book is you're telling a personal story because you grew up or you converted into, at a young age, a kind of fundamentalist Christian community. So my question wasn't, it touches on anti-Semitism, it was really about, what did you hear growing up about the Jews? Like what is that whole weird, like our special role piece of it in their theology?
Yeah. So this is such a really important question, and it makes sense why it's so confusing from the outside. So if you are part of these communities, you're going to hear that the Jewish people are God's chosen people, and that they play a very unique role in the history of Earth and God's plan for everyone here. But there's a fancy word for how these kinds of Christians view the Jewish people in relationship to themselves. That fancy word is supersessionist, meaning, right, that they believe that once Jesus came and everything took root in terms of the Christian tradition, that superseded, right, the God's covenant with Israel, the Hebrew Bible, what they call the Old Testament, and so on and so forth. And therefore, the Jewish people are those that in some ways are to be loved and admired because they are God's chosen people. But evangelicals and white Christian nationalists generally also view Jewish people as they had everything going for them and they missed it. They didn't see the Messiah when he came, even though, had all of the revelations from God, the prophets, King David, and so on. And so there's this sense of if you are not someone, including a Jewish person, who sees Jesus as the Messiah, then regardless of who you are outside of God's kingdom. Now, that gets confusing because you're like, yeah, but I've seen these people and all they talk about is Israel. Israel's the best. Israel, Israel, Israel. In ways that are deeply offensive. They often have Israeli flags. I have been to Christian gatherings as a researcher recently where people have menorahs, shofar. The idea there is this: Israel is still, and Jerusalem especially, is still a key part to the unfolding plan of God's return to earth. When Jesus returns, Jerusalem will be center stage. Israel itself will be center stage. I can sum this up by saying what this results in is a deep love and admiration for the idea of Israel, and often a very there's a kind of frustration, I'll say, at best, with Jewish friends or neighbors who don't see Jesus, and more often than not, it veers into what I would call a kind of anti-Semitism, whether subtle or not, that sees Jewish people as somehow not just not Christian, but as those who perhaps stand against the interests of the United States, that this nationalist fervor is not one in which the Jewish people take part, and in fact, they might be those who would upend the nationalist desire for a strong America through what is couched in very anti-Semitic terms as a globalist new world order or something of this. So you can see here, right, a deep love, quote unquote, I put that in quotes, for Israel, is always talking about Israel, and yet anti-Semitic impulses and tropes within these communities that are right there. The best example of this recently was Doug Mastriano. He ran for governor in Pennsylvania. He lost. But there was this famous press conference where he was asked this question, and his wife was so frustrated, she made him get off the podium, and she got up and said, "We love Israel more than any of the Jews in this country."
Trump has echoed that a bit
Yeah.
also. And I will tell you from my side, I've seen in the Jewish community, this is a couple of years ago, but the evangelicals put a lot of money into Israel, and I've seen interviews with Israeli politicians who are asked, their theology is that when Jesus comes back, you will have the choice to convert or die. Isn't that aren't you concerned about take? And they're like, well, we'll take their money, and when that happens, we'll worry about it then. So it was a little bit cynical, and I think one of the other questions that you may want to get to is how do we raise the alarms? Certainly in the Jewish community, am I freezing up? When they say things like Judeo-Christian, that's another phrase that we're trying to push back on, because on almost all of these issues, there is no consensus between the Jewish and the white Christian nationalist perspective on things like LGBTQ equality, where we have overwhelming support in the Jewish community, and women's equality, abortion access, all of these things Jews are overwhelmingly supportive of.
Yeah, so I think I coming from the field of religious studies, any religious studies scholar worth their salt will say that, coming from that perspective, Judeo-Christian is a terrible term because it's used by one group. It's always used by which group? By the conservative, Christian American, who wants it to sound as if they are a magnanimous, expansive, inclusive person whose theology includes we're just not Christian. No, it's Judeo-Christian. And then we show up to the table, and a lot of the folks sitting there, including many of the Jewish folks, are like, well, here's actually how I feel about reproductive rights, LGBTQ issues, right? Women's autonomy and independence, so on and so on. And then they go, oh, well, forget the Judeo, right? We won't be using that anymore. So I just in the way that they profess this admiration for Israel and often a disdain for Jewish people, the Judeo-Christian is, when it's useful, they use it. When it's not, they get rid of it. And it's really telling when that happens, I think, because they're showing you when you're no longer useful as a group that they are trying to add on to whatever it is they're trying to accomplish. And so I think I don't know exactly how to sound the alarms, but I guess for me, somebody who studies these things and has participated them in his youth, I would just say that I would be deeply, deeply, deeply suspicious of any group that is trying to invest in or court, political, political teamwork with these folks, because I know what lies underneath there, and it's not something I would want to sign up for. So.
You're on mute, Linda.
Thank you for making that distinction with Judeo-Christian, because that's so important to the discussion. you in your book really talked about how you were so involved when you were young. And I think when we are young, we can be very passionate about religion, about our beliefs, and feel very that we're on the right side of
Yeah.
of our beliefs. And we have a lot of people asking in the chat to talk about how white Christian nationalists groom or educate their young to get them involved in this movement.
Yeah, I think for me, and I think this will answer that second part of the question. When I converted at 14, I never expected to want to be a religious person. I went to church with my girlfriend on a Wednesday night, thinking this was a great way to, at 14 years old, get my mom to let me out of the house on a Wednesday night, which she never would have unless it was for church. And I instantly found two things at church. I found community. I found people that said, come into this group. Let's go to summer camp. Let's go to, the beach and have a bonfire. Let's welcome you into something that can become your second family. And they answered all of my existential questions in a way that my teenage brain really needed at the moment. What happens after you die? What's the point of life? Why do we suffer? Why do bad things happen? There was no long division in those answers. It was like automatic, which felt really good. For somebody who's spent his life overthinking everything as a professor and a proto professor, it felt really good to have those answers just be sort of there, automatically filled in. When you think of folks who are participating in these movements now, their politics will be disdainful to you. Their actions will often be ones where you're like, I don't understand how you arrive at such cruelty. And I share that with you. I share that. There are humans underneath there who oftentimes are seduced into this because they are feeling that they live in a time of uncertainty and vulnerability, and they long for community and they long for answers. They're invited into a story that's bigger than them, and it gives them a role to play in the world. They may not be happy with their career. They may feel like they have a failed marriage. They may feel like they're nobody who lives in a small town in a place that's never on the news. But this is a chance to be part of a battle, a war, an epic that's way bigger and way more important than anything. And so it could be the 15-year-old like me, but oftentimes I think it's sort of the young parents who are 32 and they got a 3-year-old. And they think, church would be good for us. We'll learn, we'll make friends, and the kids will have a place to go. And 3 years later, they're the ones driving down the street with the Let's Go Brandon flag on the truck and, listening to Charlie Kirk on the way to the office in the morning and telling you why everyone at the school board is a groomer, right? And so I think that's sort of a very expedited understanding of how this pipeline gets going, and how you can see people sort of seduced into it. I see that often. People who, when I was in high school, thought of me as the weird religious guy. I was that person, Linda, who would walk around at lunch and see if people wanted to hear about Jesus, Those folks who thought I was nuts then are now middle-aged folks that have taken their kids back to church. And when I look at their Instagram, I am horrified by the kinds of political things that I see there. And so they have gone looking for an identity and a story, and they're finding it in these churches.
There's a question in the Q&A that I think might offer some practical steps. So Sharon says, in my community, several Moms for Liberty were elected to the local school board. Their affiliation was a surprise since they didn't mention it when they were candidates for election. How do you suggest finding out if candidates are Christian nationalists before they get elected?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's really hard. Moms for Liberty has done so much damage in such a short amount of time. I think one of the things that is just really important when it comes to school board stuff, and I think most folks here know this, and nothing I'm going to say here is going to be revelatory, is just paying attention. Because I think, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, perhaps, there was not a lot of attention on school boards, right? There was always the folks that really were invested in the school system. They wanted to steer it the way they felt was best. It didn't feel like a community-wide issue in the small town in Pennsylvania or the small town in Northern California or Oregon. And now it is. So I have spoken all over the country in the past couple of years, And the amount of times I have heard, yeah, that school board seat was won by a hardcore right winger because no one else ran against them. Right. I've heard that so many times. And so I think when school boards are happening, or school board elections are happening, just attention and deep investment in like who's running, what do they stand for? Can we figure out where their money's coming from? Let's press them on issues related to school curricula, related to what's in the library, related to LGBTQ issues and things like that. And let's make sure we vet them like we would, right? Somebody running for an office that often gets more eyeballs on it, whether that's legislature or Congress or Senate or whatever. So I think that's one. And I think two is just realizing that this is a long haul. One of the things I argue in the book is that Christian nationalists are not just invested in who's president. It may feel like that. It may just feel like Trump all the time, but they want to control every ligament and muscle and tendon in this American body. They want to make sure that the school board, the county supervisor, the mayor are all going to forward their understanding of the right kind of social order. So this is not going to end. It's not going to end, in November. And I think that's just something to keep in mind. I didn't want to call the book Preparing for War, and I don't like war, and I'm not preparing for war. I don't want to do any of that. But one side has been preparing for war since the 1960s. Like they have been doing this and they will keep doing it. I think there's some folks who think, well, let's just get Trump out of our politics and we can go back to brunch and pickleball and it'll be great. We don't have to pay attention anymore. And I just think that's not true. And the school boards are one that's going to keep being a place of battle.
Dr. Onishi, if, as you said, a lot of these white Christian nationalists surprisingly are not churchgoers. Where is this messaging come from? How are they spreading it? And part of the question that I'm asking is then how do we counter it? And what can we do to counter that white Christian nationalism? I mean, it seems in our education system, post-World War II, we were so pro-democracy. We were so proud of having triumphed over the Nazis, and now we have gone from that into something that is more echoing autocracy and that message. So I just I threw in a whole truckload there.
No, it's good though. It's good. It's all related. So I think let's think about the Christian nationalists who are going to church. When they walk into church on Sunday, they're going to hear their minister or pastor speak for 40 minutes in the sermon. And that's maybe the only time they see them. And if that pastor's message doesn't align with all the other voices that they've heard that week who are swirling around in their brain, then they'll probably leave that church. Okay. So so the next question is, who are those voices? Well, those voices are all of the podcasts, all of the YouTube channels, all of the Fox News segments, all of the Newsmax segments, right? All of the sources of information that they are getting in their cosmos, all of the Instagram posts that they're scrolling through, right? All of the social media creators that they love. And so by the time you get to church, you've probably already heard from 30 people telling you what America should look like before you got there. So what that means is you actually don't need church, right? You actually don't need it. That you can be somebody who is like, yeah, this used to be a great Christian nation and we got away from it. That's why I'm for Trump. That's why I'm doing this and that. Okay. Do you go to church? No, not really. But listen, it's about values and morals, and it's about a strong family, and all of you are groomers, and all of you are for CRT, and all of you are for Marxism. Well, where'd you learn all that? And they can point you, right? And we can point to all those sources. One of the things I say a lot to folks is, I remember in the 1990s when a lot of the dads in my community were totally into Rush Limbaugh, right? And this is, pretty gross stuff. And I remember my stepfather like driving to work and listening to Rush Limbaugh. And when he got home, he didn't have anything else. Like he rarely watched the news, didn't really read the newspaper. There was no YouTube, right? So Rush Limbaugh was the one voice, and Rush Limbaugh did a lot of damage to him in terms of his politics. It got pretty gross. Well, now in the car, podcast telling you all about, right, the conspiracy against America. Get home, how many YouTube videos, how many Instagram posts, okay? So you can be a Christian spouting the idea of a Christian nationalist agenda, saying we used to be a Christian country, and now the woke, globalist, Marxist, Antifa, Black Lives Matter, immigrant, whatever bogeyman you want to pick off the menu that day has ruined this place. And if we don't get back to it by way of Trump and all this other stuff, we will decline. You can participate in that whole story without ever setting foot in that Sunday service as a Christian. Now, what do we do about it? I would say there's two ways to sort of approach it, and I think I segment them off for strategic reasons. When it comes to the civic sphere, we have to realize that they are preparing for war. My presentation today, I could talk for 3 hours about all the examples of people saying we need a red Caesar, we need a Christian prince, that Viktor Orban is the preeminent example of a Christian leader, that I can show you candidates for office from the GOP that say that Vladimir Putin is the Christian leader that we should emulate in this country. There's somebody who ran for Senate in Delaware in 2020, Lauren Vitska, who says that she wished Putin would come liberate us from the Joe Biden regime. Okay. So they're in. And so civically, when it comes to elections, when it comes to policy, we have to realize the state we're in, right? And I would just say, and again, I think with the group here, I'm preaching to the choir, but it's February. We're 1 month into 2024. What's one thing you're going to do this year that you've not done before to kind of realize that we're at a place where democracy is at stake? We're a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious place for people who are trying to live out the American experiment is under deep threat. Can you do one thing this year you've never done before? Write postcards, make phone calls, walk the block, go to a center, a reproductive rights center or place in your community and volunteer, whatever it may be. Now, personally, I think there's a little bit of a different strategy for me. And it goes like this. If you're able to be in a relationship with someone in your life in a safe way, right? In a safe way, that's the key part, who's gone down this path. For me, one of the most important sort of things to understand is the emotion behind their kind of participation. I have fallen, I've fallen into the trap of talking with folks who I disagree very strongly on these things. And as soon as they give me their position, I go into professor mode and I'm like, well, here's why you're absolutely wrong and an idiot. Right. And that does no good at all. It turns out it doesn't help anyone and they stop listening. Who knew? When I say, hey, cousin at the barbecue, hey, colleague I used to work with, hey, person that I grew up with, you seem like really resentful. Like, what's up? Who do you resent? You seem scared. What's up with that? Who are you scared of? And what are you scared of? For your kids, for you? What do you hope for? Like, what would make you feel good, like in terms of an outcome in the future? And if I ask those questions, I'm still going to hear a lot of stuff that I really don't like. But if I do it, they may get to a point where they let me do the same, where I can say, I got 2 little kids and I'm scared. And, this makes me angry. And I feel like that's unfair, right? And then maybe we're like 2 people, colleagues, cousins, whatever, who are just humans. And all of a sudden, everything Fox News told them about me, that I'm like a pedophile, groomer, Marxist, Antifa, God-hating, America-hating Satanist, they're not looking at me that way. I'm just a human who's also scared and afraid and worried and whatever else. It takes time. It may take more than one conversation. It takes a lot of emotional energy and investment. But if that's what you want to do, I think on a personal level, that's going to serve you better than what I think most of us have done before on the Facebook wall or the Twitter thread or wherever and said, here's why everything you just said is wrong and I'm dumber for knowing it. And let me tell you why. It just doesn't work, it turns out.
That's really great. And I'm going to watch the recording and listen to that definitely like 3 more times, because so much of what you're doing is kind of the impetus behind Jews for a Secular Democracy, is to be in conversation with the wider society to say, hey, this is us, we are Jewish, and our religion, even frankly, Orthodox Judaism in most cases has a very different take on things, and we're part of this country. And if we can do that on the interpersonal level and not on the top down, maybe not necessarily the hardest of the hardcore folks, but that big kind of middle, we might be able to break through to some of them. And I think part of it is they just haven't heard from folks who are impacted by it. I'm going to combine a couple of pieces from two different questions and then kind of morph it into a third question. But Kathy wrote, I live in North Carolina where our lieutenant governor is running for the Republican nomination for governor and is a Black man who is a Christian nationalist. And then a little bit further down, someone points out that Christians also encompass Eastern Orthodox Christians. And, so I think part of the challenge is like the phrase of art, and we've gone back and forth between Christian nationalists and white Christian nationalists. And you do spend a significant part of your book explaining why the white is in white Christian nationalists. Can you touch on that?
Yeah, great question. And so there's a lot of really good sociological data that shows us that there are Christian nationalists in this country who are people of color and who are Black. Okay. So there are, for example, there are Black folks in North Carolina, according to sociological data, that will tell you this is a Christian nation, things like that. And then you start asking them about the country and the story they tell. And that's what I want to emphasize. The story they tell of the country is this country's never lived up to its Christian principles, but we could have a more perfect union. We could have a more perfect union where we actually live up to the calling of equality, of liberty, but we've never done it. That's a different story than what you get on the whole when you look at the sociological data from white Christian nationalists. They're going to tell you a story of nostalgia and decline and apocalypse. Hey, we used to be great. Now we're in an apocalypse. We better decide if we're going to be great again. So they tell two different stories. So I think Raphael Warnock might be a good example, right? I mean, we'd have to really get into it. Is Raphael Warnock a Christian nationalist? I don't know. Don't quote me and don't put that. You can put it on the, Senator Warnock and whatever else. But when you listen to him talk as a Christian, as a preacher, he's always talking about like a hopeful message, like we could live up to our covenant as Americans. He's always talking like that. To me, that's what you hear most often in communities of color and Black communities that are talking about a Christian country. Does that mean I really like it? I'm not going to lie. I don't really like the idea that this is a Christian country. I don't think it's not true historically. And I think that it's hurtful to anyone who's not a Christian. If you're Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, if you don't have a religion, the idea that this is a Christian country is, I think it marginalizes people from the time it leaves someone's lips. Now, what happens with the example from North Carolina, or like with Herschel Walker? Does everybody remember Herschel Walker ran for Senate in Georgia against Raphael Warnock? We might talk about Tim Scott a little bit. I think we can also talk about Nikki Haley. My argument would be that there have long been, and I'm one of them because I'm a mixed race person, folks who have been brought into white Christian nationalist communities and been offered things that felt like benefited them at the cost of having to relate to their identity as people of color or Black people in a way that is costly. I'll just say it. It took me a long time to realize the anti-Asian feelings and ideas that I inherited and learned in the church that I participated in. It took me a long time to reckon with the idea that by the time I left that church, I saw my Asian American identity as other, as weird, as our food. At the cookout at my church, it was always turkey sandwiches. It was never kimchi somehow, right? There was no, sashimi on the table. And if I had brought that, someone would have been like, that's smelly food and weird. Get it out of here, right? So I think you can cozy up to whiteness. I think you can try to position yourself in a place where you're useful to the white Christian nationalist agenda. And that's how I see the candidate like Herschel Walker or Nikki Haley sort of leveraging their identity and a Christian sort of ethos to kind of get close to power and obtain power for themselves.
I know we're kind of running to the end. Paul, I don't know if you wanted to have a final question here.
Yeah, I just want to
Wrap up.
follow up on that then, and then we'll close out. But one other piece of it, though, that I'd like you to kind of build out a little bit is the actual origins or the strengthening of white Christian nationalism really did happen around race, right, in terms of the civil rights movement. And so
Yeah.
I think that's a key component as well. Can you talk a little bit about, I mean, and you touched on how they nostalgized the 50s, right? I mean, when you had segregation. So it's like, well, how did everything kind of emerge out of that?
Yeah, I think a key vector here is in the 1950s, we have Brown v. Board of Education, 1954. So what that means is supposedly the integration of American schools, especially in the American South. By the time you get to the 60s, it's not really happened yet. And so a crackdown starts. And by the time states like Virginia and Mississippi start saying, nope, we really are integrating the schools now, there's no white kids left, because the white Christians had taken their kids out of public schools and put them into church adjacent segregation academies, schools that were only available for white children. Eventually, the IRS started threatening the tax-exempt status of those churches. And that was a major catalyst for political action on the part of many white Christians in the country. The reaction to the IRS showing up and saying, hey, if you're going to have a segregationist sort of policy, go ahead. You're not tax exempt anymore. Sorry. Was not, yeah, I wonder if we should re-examine our racism or our segregationist policy or really rethink that. It was, I can't believe you hate God and I can't believe you hate this country. We have no choice but to get involved in politics now. You've just crossed the line. We really got to do it. So if you look at the 60s and the 70s and the formation of the religious right, the Jerry Falwells, the Pat Robertsons, the Tim LaHaye's, that's all in the background. I mean, Jerry Falwell ran a segregationist church and a segregationist school during these years that he's criticizing Martin Luther King Jr. So that is not ancient history, of course. It's all still part of our discourse. Charlie Kirk, one of the most influential Christian nationalists in the country, just said on Martin Luther King Jr. Day that he was a bad person. He also says things like, I'm not sure I want to get on a plane with there's a black pilot, because he's probably only there or she's only there because of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. So none of this is ancient history, unfortunately.
It's clear that we're only scratching the surface on this, and so it touches every aspect of American life in a lot of ways. And I really appreciate all you've done to illuminate us in this webinar. And also, if folks have not yet gotten the book, I really encourage you to go get it. It is a quick read, but it is a disturbing one, but it will open your eyes to what's happening in this country. So thank you for writing that, and thanks for being here. And we hope that we can reach out again in the future and reconnect. No,
thanks so much for inviting me. It's been great. And thank you for wonderful questions. And you know, Paul and Linda and Katie, thank you for all your work to make it happen. So thanks for having me.
Great. Thanks everyone for being here. Take care.